All right, so good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whenever and wherever you may be watching and listening to this video. This is week 6 of HY2207, the struggle for modern China since 1800. And today we will begin our exploration of China's post-imperial history with the history of the first quarter century of the Republic of China from 1912 to 1937. In this period, the new republic is first plunged into a period of political decentralization and fragmentation at the hands of regional military warlords by the end of the 1910s. It is then unified by force and imperfectly in 1927 or so by the combined forces of the Chinese Nationalist Party, KMT, and the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, after which the KMT turns against the CCP and spends the rest of the decade trying to destroy it. The CCP somehow manages to survive. In the decade from 1928 to 37, the KMT rules from the city of Nanjing and embarks on an ambitious but ultimately unsuccessful program of social, political, and cultural engineering. This program and the KMT's rift with the CCP are set aside in 1937 when Japan, having seized control of Manchuria in 1931, invades the rest of China. Today we will meet Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek for the first time, and we will also bid farewell to Sun Yat-sen and Yuan Shikai. But the political and military narrative is only one part of the story of the Republic of China. This was a violent period, far more so than the last years of the Qing. It was also a period of extraordinary cultural and intellectual ferment, characterized by innovation in literature, new ideologies, new visions of society, self, and gender. I will first give you a standard political and military narrative and then look at multiple aspects of Republican-era culture, society, and intellectual life, including the all-important May 4th movement of 1919 and the KMT's New Life movement in the 1930s. So, a new republic had been born. But what would it look like? Who would lead it? In the absence of an emperor as a unifying figure. Temporarily, at least, Sun Yat-sen became its provisional president, even though he had not been in China during the 1911 Wuchang Uprising. This was a testament to his status and reputation among the various political factions at the time. Ahead of the forthcoming National Assembly elections, Sun Yat-sen transformed the revolutionary Tongmenghui into a political party, the Chinese Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang or KMT. He then stepped down as provisional president of the republic and transferred power to Yuan Shikai because of the powerful military forces that Yuan Shikai commanded. He also nominated the person on the slide, the 30-year-old Song Jiaren, to lead the new KMT and to contest the elections, which the KMT won with 43% of the vote. Now, these elections tell us something about both the promise and limitations of the fledgling republic. They were carried out remarkably smoothly, and in hindsight, they were the high point of electoral democracy in both China and subsequently Taiwan, until, of course, the late 1980s and early 1990s in post-martial law Taiwan. But just like the representative assembly elections in the late Qing that we talked about in week 5, very few Chinese people could actually vote or run in these elections. You had to own a certain amount of property, for example, and pay a certain amount of taxes. So in class terms, these elections enabled elites from the late Qing period to retain and expand their power in the new republic. And women were not allowed to vote, even though the Tongmenghui had included in its platform a clause insisting on the equality of men and women. And so this outraged women suffragists. In a powerful display of their anger and sense of betrayal, 3 female Tongmenghui members, including Tang Chunying, assaulted Song Jiaren during a speech that he was giving in August 1912. Now, far worse was to follow for Song Jiaren, however. In March 1913, on his way to Beijing from Shanghai to form the new government, the man who more than any other individual embodied China's hopes for a democratic, republican future was assassinated. This is one of the great what-if moments in modern Chinese history. What if Song Jiaren had survived and taken over the KMT after Sun Yat-sen's death rather than Chiang Kai-shek? The man responsible for his assassination was Yuan Shikai, who had no intention of giving up the political power that he had accumulated. Backed by his own military forces, Yuan proceeded to outlaw the KMT and abolish all political assemblies, among other authoritarian measures. He also continued with some of the late Qing reforms, but he is almost universally remembered today as the great betrayer of Chinese democracy. And in response, the Kuomintang proceeded to launch a second revolution, again, this time against Yuan Shikai. In August 1915, Yuan Shikai made plans to restore the empire and make himself grand constitutional emperor, as if a return to monarchy was the solution to China's problems at the time. And in the slide, you see Yuan at his inauguration as the Hongxian emperor. But it was telling that Yuan Shikai's attempt to turn back the clock and to appeal to tradition did not work. There was no going back to the imperial system. Even his own Beiyang military forces were ambivalent about this. Japan crucially began supporting the KMT, and various provinces of the Republic started declaring their independence in the same manner that they had seceded from the Qing just a few years earlier. Yuan Shikai died in 1916 of illness, and the country collapsed into chaos. So this next phase in the Republic's history saw political power divided among multiple competing military strongmen similar to Yuan Shikai. If we take a longer-term view, we can trace this phenomenon, warlordism, back to the mid-19th century, to the militarization of Qing society, and to the devolution of political power from Beijing to provincial scholar elites. This took place during and after the Taiping Civil War, and we talked about this in tutorial 1 and week 3. So the political descendants of these warlords, in other words, were men like Zheng Guofan, Zuo Zhongtang, and Li Hongzhang. Warlordism was also a consequence of the failure of the late Qing reform movement, the Xinzheng reforms, to build a state strong enough to rein in localized political power. Let's look at a few of these warlords, and it's kind of interesting that some of these warlords were surprisingly progressive and might even have had the potential to unite China and become its head of state. So, Feng Yuxiang in North China, for example, was a convert to Christianity, who indoctrinated his troops with both Christian and traditional Chinese values and baptized them with a fire hose. He was also a reformer, establishing orphanages, public schools, and drug rehabilitation centers in his domain. This slide shows Feng featured on the cover of Time magazine, and it is worth thinking about why so many Chinese persons figured on the cover of this very famous American magazine. Other warlords were let's just say they were less than capable. One of the more notorious warlords was Zhang Zhongshan, the dog meat general based in Shandong. One journalist described him as having the physique of an elephant, the brain of a pig, and the temperament of a tiger. Zhang apparently had 3 don't knows. He didn't know how much money he had, he did not know how many troops he had, and he did not know how many women he had in his harem. Now, thinking historiographically here, the conventional view of this period is that it was a chaotic period in which political coalitions formed and dissolved, assassinations were commonplace, and ordinary persons suffered amidst endemic warfare. Yet we might also ask if the term warlord, the very pejorative term warlord, presupposes that unity and a strong central state are in themselves desirable, and that the devolution of power from the center is inherently undesirable. The term warlord or Junfa was in fact used by the KMT to describe its enemies. And in fact, the communists even used the term to describe Chiang Kai-shek. And so even though this term warlord caught on, it has also served to obscure federalist ideas, such as those advanced by the man shown here, Chen Jiongming. Federalist ideas were in fact immensely popular after 1895 among scholars and politicians, including Sun Yat-sen himself. Now, one consequence of this period, one of the most important developments in this period was the founding of the CCP. Sun Yat-sen had been driven from China yet again, this time by Yuan Shikai. He regrouped and reimagined his revolutionary project with support from a new political movement. The CCP was founded in July 1921 by Marxist intellectuals affiliated with Peking University. And the publication New Youth or Xin Chien-Yen, and these included Chen Duxiu, the party's first secretary general, who was a professor at PKU, and Li Dazhao, who was a librarian. One of Li Dazhao's friends was Mao, who was among the delegates at the first CCP Congress in Shanghai, which I had the privilege of visiting at the end of last year, but Mao was not yet a leading figure in the party. Let's think a little bit now about what Marxism-Leninism was and why it was appealing to these persons. Now, first, from the standpoint of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, it can be difficult, I think, to understand communism's appeal given the horrors inflicted in its name and its dismal economic record. But even today, even if you are not a communist, Marxist thought serves as a powerful critique of the regnant economic ideology of our time, which is neoliberal capitalism, as well as of imperialism. If we go back to the early 20th century, in 1921, a revolutionary Marxist-Leninist movement had just succeeded in overthrowing a centuries-old monarchy in a huge land-based empire similar to that of the Qing, which is to say, Russia. Marxist-Leninism, or so Marxists believed, was a universal scientific ideology that purported to explain the march of history, and it appealed to intellectuals seeking sweeping solutions to China's multiple problems, from poverty to imperialism. Now, in 1921, the foreign forces present at the founding of the CCP were not just the spirits of Marx, Lenin, and Engels, but actual agents of the Soviet Union and an organization known as the Communist International, or Comintern. And it is the Comintern that helped found the CCP and played a huge and decisive role in Chinese history during this period. How did the Comintern view China? In the eyes of the Comintern, China was not ready for a communist revolution because there just weren't enough communists in the country who could serve as the vanguard of this revolution. So it urged the CCP to enter into a temporary, tactical, united front, a marriage of convenience with the KMT against their common enemies, which were warlords and foreign imperialists. This was not something that either side was especially keen on. Ideologically, the Kuomintang and the CCP were quite far apart. The CCP was committed to revolutionary anti-capitalist social change. The KMT believed that only capitalism welded to centralized state power could overcome China's poverty and enable it to compete on the global capitalist imperialist stage. But in the 1920s, Sun Yat-sen was desperate for help, and Russia could provide such aid. And so Sun Yat-sen agreed to the United Front, which was brokered by the gentleman in the picture here, Mikhail Borodin. It was the CCP that had to be forced by the Comintern to join the KMT and to subordinate itself to the KMT. And so for a short period of time, Mao actually worked as the KMT's propaganda chief. In 1923, with the formation of this united front, the KMT and CCP set in motion plans to defeat the warlords and unite China. The Comintern helped restructure the KMT into what is known as a democratic centralist party, a Leninist democratic centralist party that was structurally similar to the CCP. Now, briefly put, in such a party, debate and discussion are allowed at lower levels of the party hierarchy, but when the top leadership of the party, the Central Executive Committee, ultimately makes all the decisions, and everyone else has to follow its orders. This is in fact exactly how some political parties in this country are organized, such as the People's Action Party and even the Workers' Party. Now, clearly, not only was a political organization required, but also a powerful army. To form this powerful army, the Comintern helped the KMT establish in 1924 the Huangpu Military Academy near Canton that would train soldiers who were loyal to the KMT. And the first commandant of the academy was none other than Chiang Kai-shek. He was a Tongmenghui and then a KMT member, and he had received military training in China, Tokyo, and Moscow. His military background and understanding of the political situation in the 1920s convinced him that China needed a strong state and a strong military and could not become communist. Sun Yat-sen died in 1925. Chiang Kai-shek proceeded to outmaneuver his main rival for leadership of the Kuomintang, a man by the name of Wang Jingwei. Wang Jingwei was the head of the so-called left KMT, that favored greater cooperation with the communists. And so Chiang Kai-shek outmaneuvered him and gained control of the party, after which he launched his campaign to reunify China, the Northern Expedition. The expedition would ultimately succeed in bringing most, though not all, areas of China under KMT control by 1928. In the course of the campaign, however, Chiang Kai-shek turned against the communists. The setting for this betrayal was Shanghai. In May 1925, the death of a Chinese worker by a Japanese foreman at a Japanese textile mill sparked large-scale protests and violence by foreign troops against protesters. This was the May 30th, 1925 incident, and there's a poster depicting it on this slide. The incident catalyzed support for the CCP. It enabled workers, the communists, to mobilize the workers to wrest control of Shanghai from the local warlord and deliver the city into Chiang's army in early 1927. So the communists, in that sense, were helping Chiang Kai-shek to gain control of Shanghai. What did Chiang Kai-shek do next? Chiang Kai-shek proceeded to declare martial law and purge Shanghai of the CCP and its supporters. Chiang felt that he no longer needed the CCP as part of the United Front. It was not only the KMT troops that were involved in this white terror, but also gangsters associated with Shanghai's most notorious criminal organization known as the Green Gang, which had close ties to the KMT. This purge spread rapidly to the rest of China in the following years, claiming the lives of over 1 million people, most of whom were peasants, whom the CCP was trying to mobilize. And the KMT persisted in trying to destroy the CCP across the 1930s. Now, we know, of course, that the CCP survived. It, in fact, was nearly extinguished. You might be asking, how did Joseph Stalin react to the end of the United Front? Well, it turned out that Joseph Stalin was somewhat indifferent towards the fate of the CCP. Stalin saw the need for a fully fledged capitalist social system before the working class could challenge the bourgeoisie. So in fact, he continued to call for unity between the two parties even after Chiang Kai-shek had launched this campaign of white terror against suspected communists. In cities such as Canton, the CCP sought to organize resistance to the KMT, but it was crushed. Those party members who were not killed or imprisoned had different options available to them. Some fled from cities to their home villages in the countryside. Others went underground in large cities. And others went to Southeast Asia, where they joined with local communists in Southeast Asia and helped found political parties such as the Malayan Communist Party in 1930. We know, of course, that the CCP did not perish, but changed and survived against considerable odds. Its travails in the 1930s and 40s remain etched into the party's official memory. It was in this period that Mao rose to power within the party. So let me say a few things about Mao. Mao was born in Hunan in 1893 into a relatively wealthy peasant family. Unlike the CCP's other founders, he had not studied abroad. He spoke only Mandarin, and in fact, his Mandarin came in a thick, often unintelligible Hunanese accent. The first time he left Hunan was in 1918 for Beijing. And so Mao's background, I think, explains why he had a slightly different understanding of revolution compared to that of other CCP members and the Comintern. Now, in orthodox Marxist theory, it is the urban proletariat, right, the urban working class that is supposed to rise up against the bourgeoisie, the property-owning capitalist middle class. Communist mobilization is supposed to take place among factory workers, immiserated by industrial capitalism. Mao, however, believed in the revolutionary potential of peasants, who of course constituted most of China's population. And this worldview was the product of his own time spent living in rural China, in Hunan, and observing how peasants organized themselves in opposition to systems of oppression, systems of class oppression, systems of gender oppression that had been imposed upon them for millennia. Mao elaborated on these views toward revolution in his report of an investigation into the peasant movement in Hunan, which laid the theoretical groundwork for a peasant-based communist revolution in China. Now, Mao, of course, had to flee the White Terror, and in doing so, he had the opportunity to put some of these ideas into practice while also building an army capable of resisting KMT forces. Mao and some of the remnants of the CCP fled to the remote mountains of Jiangxi, and this was where Mao and his close associate Zhu De founded the Red Army. The Red Army is the precursor of the People's Liberation Army. The Red Army was a guerrilla army. In Jiangxi, Mao also established a Soviet-style government and clashed with local Jiangxi communists over leadership of this government or Soviet. Mao also found himself up against the CCP's urban leadership. He clashed ideologically and tactically with the CCP's urban leadership, right? The communists who had chosen to remain in the cities. And it was by no means clear at this point in time that Mao would become the party's leader. Now, this Jiangxi Soviet was kind of like a state within a state, and it enacted a number of redistributive and equalizing policies that would in fact come to characterize the early PRC, as we will see in a few weeks. Its land law, for example, authorized the confiscation and redistribution of land from landlords to peasants. There was a marriage law that outlawed arranged marriage, for example. The goal of this law was not so much gender equity, but rather to gain the support of women in the revolution. And as you can see from this slide, the Jiangxi Soviet even issued its own currency. In 1934, however, Mao and hundreds of thousands of Red Army and party members were forced to flee Jiangxi in the face of Chiang Kai-shek's repeated bombardments and encirclement of this area. This marks the start of a year-long circuitous forced march of some 9,000 kilometers across mountain ranges and rivers across 12 provinces in the face of hunger, illness, and bombardment from the KMT. This march spanned north and southern China, and eventually Mao and other CCP forces were able to establish a new base area in the remote region of Yan'an in Shanxi province. This is the Long March. The Long March began in defeat, which was even more crushing than its defeat in 1927. Mao acknowledged this in 1936 and said that, in short, we received an extremely great historical punishment. But today, the Long March has retroactively taken on an aura of heroism and triumph in the CCP's official narrative and become the origin myth of the Communist Party and Mao's leadership, as James Carter puts it in the chapter that you have read. Until the 1990s, and here's some propaganda on the Long March, including a poster from 2018. Until the 1990s, the political leadership of the CCP and PRC was dominated by veterans of the Long March. It was during the march that Mao cemented his leadership of the party by declaring its independence from the Comintern, from Stalin and Moscow. And his experiences during the march strengthened his, quote, already deeply ingrained voluntaristic faith that men with the proper will, spirit, and revolutionary consciousness could conquer all material obstacles and mold historical reality. This is what is known in sort of in Mao Zedong thought as voluntarism. All right, so that is an abbreviated political and military narrative of Republican China from 1912 to 1935.